there are some things so small, so ordinary, that we forget. They are still carrying stories, not loud stories, not dramatic ones, but quiet stories that wait patiently for the right moment to be remembered. In a small wooden box, placed carefully inside an old drawer, there was a card, a simple card, faded at the edges, soft from time, its color no longer clear. Once white, perhaps. Now, something between yellow and memory. The name on it, written in careful handwriting. Margaret Ellis. The ink, slightly blurred, but still readable, still alive. Margaret had not opened that drawer for a very long time. Years had passed, then more years. And slowly, life had filled itself with other things. Responsibilities, losses, quiet routines, until one afternoon, when the light fell into the room in a way that felt different, soft, golden, almost as if it was inviting her to pause. Margaret stood near the window, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the table. She did not move for a long moment. Then, something small shifted inside her. A feeling, not strong, not urgent, just a gentle pull toward the past. She turned slowly, walked toward the drawer, opened it with a soft sound. Inside, the wooden box waited, just as it always had, unchanged, patient. Margaret hesitated. Her fingers hovered above it, as if touching it might awaken something. She was not ready to feel, but time has its own quiet wisdom, and sometimes it knows when we are ready, even before we do. She lifted the lid. Inside, a few old photographs, a folded letter, and beneath them, the card, the library card. Margaret picked it up, held it gently between her fingers. For a moment, she simply looked at it, not reading, not thinking, just seeing. And then, like the slow opening of a forgotten door, memories began to return, not all at once, but softly, in pieces. A building, tall windows, filled with light, rows of books, standing quietly, like old friends waiting. The smell, paper, dust, time, and a younger version of herself, walking through that space, not slowly, but with curiosity, with energy, with something she had not felt in a long time: hope. Margaret closed her eyes, the card still in her hand, and suddenly, she could hear it. The sound of pages turning, the quiet footsteps on wooden floors, the soft voice of a librarian, reminding someone to be gentle with the books. Her lips moved slightly, almost forming a smile. Almost. Then her eyes opened again. The room returned. The present, still, silent. But now, holding something more. Margaret looked down at the card again. 60 years. It had been 60 years since she first held this. 60 years since she walked into that library, since she borrowed a book, a very specific book. She frowned slightly, trying to remember. The title was just beyond reach, like a word on the tip of the tongue, almost there, but not quite. She turned the card over. There, faint marks, old stamps, dates. One of them, still visible. June, 1965. Margaret's breath slowed. Her fingers traced the number gently. 1965. She whispered it softly, as if saying it might bring everything back. And maybe it did. Because in that moment, a memory returned, clearer than before. A day, warm, bright, the sound of summer outside, and inside the library, a quiet coolness. She was younger then, her hair darker, her steps lighter, her heart open. Margaret moved slowly to a chair, sat down, the card still in her hand, her thumb resting on its edge. She looked at it again, and this time, she noticed something she had never seen before, a tiny mark near the corner, so small it could have been ignored. But now, it felt important, intentional, as if someone had left it there, a sign, a reminder. Margaret leaned closer, her eyes narrowing slightly. There was something pressed into the card, not written, not printed, but hidden. Her heart began to beat a little faster, not with fear, but with curiosity, a quiet kind of wonder. She stood up slowly, walked back to the drawer, opened the wooden box again. Carefully, she placed the card beside the old photographs, then paused, her hand resting on the edge of the box, her mind, no longer in the present, but not fully in the past either, somewhere in between, a bridge made of memory. And then a thought appeared, clear, simple, unexpected. She needed to go back to the library, the old one, if it was still there, if it still existed. After all these years, Margaret stood very still, the idea settling inside her. It was not a big plan, not something she had prepared, but it felt right, like something that had been waiting for a long time, waiting for her to notice. She closed the box gently, but this time she did not put it away. Instead, she kept the card in her hand, holding it as if it might lead her somewhere, because maybe it would. Maybe this small, forgotten object was not just a memory. Maybe it was the beginning of something she had yet to understand. Margaret did not leave immediately. The thought of returning to a place that belonged to another version of herself needed time to settle. She stood near the door, her hand resting on the handle, but she did not open it yet. The house around her was quiet, not an empty quiet, but a familiar one, the kind of silence that had slowly grown over the years, a silence made of routines, of evenings alone, of mornings that arrived gently, without interruption. She looked down at the card again, still in her hand, still light, and yet it felt heavier now, as if it carried something more than paper. She exhaled softly. Then, finally, she opened the door. The air outside greeted her, cooler than she expected. There was a faint breeze. It touched her face and moved gently through her hair. Margaret stepped out, closing the door behind her. The street looked the same, and not the same at all. Houses still stood. Trees still lined the sidewalk. But time had changed the details. Colors were different. Some fences had been replaced, some gardens, no longer cared for. She began to walk, slowly, not because she had to, but because she wanted to feel each step. The rhythm of walking felt grounding, familiar. She had walked many paths in her life, but this one felt like it was leading her backward and forward at the same time. As she moved along the street, small things began to catch her attention. A child's laughter, echoing from a nearby yard, the sound of a bicycle passing by, the distant hum of a car, life continuing, unaware of the quiet journey happening inside her. Margaret reached the corner. She paused there, just for a moment, because she remembered this corner used to have a small shop, a bakery. She could almost smell it now. Fresh bread, warm pastries. She closed her eyes briefly, letting the memory pass through her. When she opened them again, the shop was gone. In its place, a modern building stood. Glass windows, clean lines, different, but not wrong. Just New. Margaret nodded slightly, as if accepting something, without needing to explain it. Then she continued walking. The library was not far. At least, it had not been far. All those years ago. But time has a way of stretching distances. Or perhaps it was not the distance, but the weight of memory that made each step feel longer. She turned onto another street. This one felt more familiar. The trees here were older, taller. Their branches stretched across the sky, forming a soft canopy of green. Sunlight filtered through the leaves, creating patterns on the ground. Margaret slowed even more, her eyes moving carefully, taking everything in, because somewhere here was the path she used to walk, the exact path, the one that led to the library, and then she saw it, at the end of the street, partially hidden, behind the trees, the building. Her breath caught slightly, not from surprise, but from recognition. It was still there, changed, but still there. The structure had been updated, the walls repainted, the entrance redesigned. But something, deep in its shape, remained the same. Margaret stood still, looking at it, for a long moment, as if confirming that it was real, that it had not disappeared, like so many other things. Then she took a step forward, and another, until she stood right in front of it. The doors were larger now, glass instead of wood. She could see inside, people moving quietly, books still lining the walls, a familiar stillness, living inside a modern space. Margaret hesitated, her reflection faintly visible in the glass. An older woman, holding a small, worn card. She studied that reflection, not with sadness, not with regret, but with a quiet curiosity, as if asking who she had become and whether the girl from 60 years ago would recognize her. Then, gently, she pushed the door open. The sound was soft, almost like a whisper. And as she stepped inside, the air changed, cooler, stiller, and filled with something she had not realized she missed. The smell of books, paper, ink, time. Margaret closed her eyes, just for a second, letting that feeling settle into her. Then she opened them again. The interior was brighter than before, more organized, more modern. But the essence, the quiet respect for stories, was still there. A librarian stood behind the front desk, typing something, focused, calm. Margaret approached slowly, her footsteps barely making a sound. When she reached the desk, she placed the card gently on its surface. The librarian looked up, her expression polite, curious. She glanced at the card, then back at Margaret. For a moment, neither of them spoke, because something about the card felt unusual, out of time. "I found this," Margaret said softly, her voice calm, but carrying something deeper. "I think it belongs here." The librarian picked up the card carefully, turning it over in her hands, her eyes scanning the faded details, the old format, the handwritten name, the date. Her expression shifted slightly, from polite curiosity to genuine interest. "This is very old," she said, almost to herself. Margaret nodded. "Yes," she replied. "I remember getting it a long time ago." The librarian looked at her again, more closely this time, as if trying to connect the person standing in front of her with the name on the card. "Margaret Ellis?" she asked. Margaret smiled faintly. "Yes?" The librarian smiled too, not just politely now, but warmly. "That's incredible," she said. "We don't see cards like this anymore. She paused, then added, "Would you like me to check if there's any record connected to it?" Margaret hesitated, just for a moment, because suddenly, this was no longer just a memory. It was becoming something real, something that might reveal what had been hidden. She looked at the card again, then back at the librarian, and nodded. "Yes," she said softly, "I would like that." The librarian turned toward the computer, typing slowly, carefully, as if handling something delicate, even though it was only data. Margaret waited, her hands resting lightly on the desk, her heart quiet but attentive, and somewhere deep inside, a feeling began to grow. Not fear, not excitement, but something in between. A quiet anticipation, as if whatever came next was not just about the past, but about something that had been waiting to be found. The librarian's fingers moved slowly across the keyboard, not rushed, not impatient, or each key pressed with care, as if she understood that this was not just a search, it was something more. Margaret stood quietly, her eyes drifting across the room. People moved gently between shelves, some reading, some searching, some simply sitting, holding a book, as if it were a companion, nothing loud, nothing urgent, and yet everything felt alive. The librarian leaned slightly closer to the screen, her expression focused. Then she paused. Her hand stopped moving. Margaret noticed, not immediately, but after a small moment, a shift, a change in the air. "Did you find something?" Margaret asked softly. The librarian did not answer right away. She read the screen again, carefully, as if making sure that what she saw was real. Then she turned the monitor slightly, not fully toward Margaret, but enough to share. "There is a record," she said quietly, her voice lower now, more thoughtful. "It's incomplete, but it's here." Margaret leaned forward, just a little, her eyes searching the screen. The text was simple, black letters, on a soft white background. A name, her name, Margaret Ellis, a date, June 1965, and beneath it, a single line, borrowed item, "The last garden of summer." Margaret's breath caught, not sharply, but enough to make her pause. "The last garden of summer," she whispered. The title felt familiar, not clearly, but like something that had once meant a great deal. "I remember," she began, then stopped, because the memory was not fully formed yet. The librarian turned back to her. "There's something else," she said. Margaret looked up. "What is it?" The librarian hesitated, only for a second. Then she clicked something on the screen. Another window opened. "This book," she continued, "was never returned." Margaret blinked slowly, her mind trying to understand. "Never returned?" she repeated. The librarian nodded. "There's no record of it being checked back in." The words hung in the air, soft but heavy. Margaret looked down at the card again, then back at the screen. "That doesn't make sense," she said quietly. "I always return my books." There was no defensiveness in her voice, only confusion. The librarian gave a small, understanding smile. "I'm sure you did," she said gently. "Records from that time weren't always complete." She paused, then added, "But there's a note here." Margaret's eyes lifted again. "A note?" The librarian nodded. "Yes, it's very short." She turned the screen a little more, and there it was. A line of text, smaller than the rest, almost hidden, handwritten, then scanned into the system years later. Margaret leaned closer, her eyes narrowing slightly. To read. If found, please check page 73. She read it once, then again, more slowly. If found, please check page 73. A silence followed, not empty, but full of questions, full of something that neither of them could name yet. What does that mean? Margaret asked softly. The librarian shook her head slightly. I'm not sure. She looked at Margaret again. But it sounds like someone left a message. Margaret's fingers tightened slightly, around the edge of the desk. A message, after all these years. Hidden inside a book she had borrowed, a book she could not fully remember. Do you still have it? Margaret asked, her voice steady, but quieter now. The librarian turned back to the computer, typing again, searching. After a moment, she exhaled softly. I think we do, she said. Margaret's heart moved, not faster, but deeper. The book was transferred to storage years ago, the librarian continued, but it wasn't removed from the system. She looked at Margaret. If you'd like, we can try to find it. Margaret did not answer immediately, because this moment felt larger than she expected. She had come here, thinking she might remember something small, a place, a feeling, but now there was something waiting, something real, something hidden. For 60 years, she nodded slowly. Yes, she said, I would like to find it. The librarian smiled, a quiet, encouraging smile. All right, she said. It may take a little time. That's okay, Margaret replied, her voice soft. I've waited this long. The librarian stood, gestured gently toward a seating area. You can sit there, she said. I'll go check the storage room. Margaret nodded. Thank you. She walked slowly to the chairs, sat down carefully, her hands resting in her lap. The library card? Still with her. She looked at it again, then closed her eyes. And for a moment, she allowed herself to feel everything. The past, the present, the quiet space in between. Footsteps faded in the distance as the librarian disappeared into the back. Time seemed to slow. Margaret listened to the soft turning of pages, to the distant movement of people, to her own breathing, and beneath it all, a question, gently rising. Who left that message? And why had it been waiting for her all this time? She opened her eyes again. The light in the room felt warmer now. Or maybe it was something inside her that had changed. Minutes passed, or maybe longer. She did not count, because this moment was not about time anymore. It was about discovery. Finally, she heard footsteps returning, slow, careful. Margaret looked up. The librarian was walking toward her, and in her hands, she carried a book, old, worn. Its cover faded, just like the card. Margaret stood slowly, her eyes fixed on it. The Last Garden of Summer, the librarian said softly. Margaret stepped closer, her hand lifting slightly, but not touching it yet, as if she needed to be sure. This was real. That's it, she whispered. The librarian nodded. I think we're about to find out what the message means. Margaret inhaled gently, then, very carefully, she reached out and took the book. It felt fragile, not just physically, but emotionally, as if it carried more than paper and ink. She held it close, then slowly opened it. Margaret did not turn the pages immediately. She simply held the book, open, but still. Her fingers rested lightly along the edges, careful, respectful, as if she were holding something that could break, not in form, but in feeling. The librarian stood nearby, quiet, patient, understanding that this moment did not need to be rushed. Margaret lowered her eyes. The first page, aged, slightly yellowed, but still strong. The title, The Last Garden of Summer, printed in soft ink, faded, but steady. She traced the letters gently, her touch slow, as if each letter was a step backward in time. Then, carefully, she turned the first page. The paper made a soft sound, barely there, but enough to mark the beginning. One page, then another, and another. Margaret did not read the words yet, not fully. Her eyes moved across the pages, but her mind was somewhere else. She was searching, not for the story, but for the place where the message had been left. Page 73, that number stayed in her mind, clear, steady, waiting. She turned more pages, slowly, carefully, each one bringing her closer, until finally, she reached it. Page 73. Her hand paused, resting on the edge of the paper. For a moment, she did not move, because something inside her felt different now. A quiet tension, not fear, but something close to it. A feeling of standing on the edge of knowing. The librarian stepped a little closer, not intruding, just present. Margaret inhaled slowly. Then, she turned the page. And there it was. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Just text, printed lines, a continuation of the story. But then, her eyes caught something, a small fold near the bottom corner. So slight, it could have been missed. But it wasn't. Not now. Not anymore. Margaret leaned closer, her fingers moving toward it. She hesitated, just for a breath, then gently. She unfolded the corner. Inside, something was hidden. A piece of paper. Thin, carefully placed, protected by time and silence. Margaret's hand trembled slightly as she slid it out. The paper was old, fragile, but still whole, still waiting. The librarian watched quietly, saying nothing, because there are moments when words are too small. Margaret looked at the paper, folded once, neatly, as if someone had taken care when placing it there. She unfolded it slowly, each movement gentle, intentional. And then she saw the writing, handwritten, soft ink, slightly faded, but still clear. Her breath caught, not sharply, but deeply, because something about the handwriting felt familiar, not immediately, but enough to stir something inside her. She began to read. If you are reading this, her voice, barely above a whisper, then maybe time has done what I could not. Margaret paused, her eyes moving slowly across the words. I didn't know how to say this then, and I was afraid that if I tried, I would lose the moment completely. The room around her seemed to soften, fade slightly, as if everything was stepping back to let this memory speak. So I am leaving this here, in a place where stories are kept, hoping that one day you might find it. Margaret's fingers tightened gently around the edge of the paper, her heart moving in a quiet rhythm. Margaret, she stopped, her name written there, clear, certain. You once told me that books remember things we forget. I didn't understand that then, but I think I do now. A memory flickered, soft, incomplete, a voice, a face just beyond reach. There was something I wanted to tell you, that day in the library. But I didn't. And then time moved forward, as it always does. Margaret's eyes filled, not with tears, but with something quieter, recognition. If you are reading this, I hope life has been kind to you, or at least gentle. And I hope you found the things you were always searching for. Her breath slowed, each word settling into her. I kept this simple because I didn't want to change anything. I just wanted to leave a piece of truth in a place that would protect it. Margaret closed her eyes briefly, letting the words rest inside her. Then she continued, "Ait, you mattered more than I ever said. And I'm sorry, I never found the courage to tell you." Silence, deep, still. Daniel, the name, soft but powerful. It opened something, not suddenly, but slowly, like a door that had always been there. Margaret's eyes remained on the page, but her mind had already begun to move, backward, through years, through moments, through a life she had almost forgotten. Daniel, the name echoed gently, and with it, a memory began to form, not complete, not yet, but enough to feel. The librarian spoke softly. "Do you remember him?" Margaret did not answer immediately, because memory is not always a clear path. Sometimes it is a slow unfolding. She opened her eyes again, looked down at the paper, then at the book, then somewhere, just beyond the present moment. "I think," she said quietly, "I'm starting to." Margaret held the letter for a long time, not reading it again, not moving, just holding it, as if letting the words settle deeper, beyond thought, into something quieter. Daniel. The name no longer felt distant. It no longer floated at the edge of memory. It was closer now, warmer, alive in a way she had not expected. She looked down at the handwriting again, the way the letters curved, the slight unevenness, as if written in a moment of hesitation. And then it came, not all at once, but gently, like light entering a room, through a small opening. A boy, sitting across from her, at a wooden table, a book between them, their voices low, whispering about stories, about dreams, about things that felt important, even if they did not fully understand them yet. Margaret's lips parted slightly. She could see him now, not clearly, but enough. Dark hair, kind eyes, always listening, more than speaking. Daniel. They had met in that library, on a quiet afternoon, both reaching for the same book. A small moment, simple, but somehow it had stayed. They began talking, first about the book, then about others, then about life, slowly, naturally, as if they had always known each other. Margaret felt her chest rise gently. The memory was no longer fragile. It was steady now. They had spent days there, sitting in the same corner, reading, talking, laughing softly. There had been something unspoken, not forced, not rushed, just present, a connection, quiet, but real. Margaret closed her eyes briefly, and she remembered the last day, the day written in the letter, the day he did not speak, the day she did not ask, the day time moved forward. She had waited, at first, a few days, then a week, then longer. But he never returned, and slowly, life carried her elsewhere, new places, new people, new responsibilities. And over time, the memory softened, faded, not lost, but quiet until now. Margaret opened her eyes again. The library returned. The present, The chair beside her, the soft light, the quiet presence of the librarian, who had stepped back, giving her space. Margaret looked down at the letter once more. You mattered more than I ever said. The words stayed with her, not a regret, but as something gentler, a truth, finally spoken, even if it had taken 60 years. She folded the paper slowly, carefully, not hiding it again, but honoring it. Then she placed it back, between the pages. Page 73, where it had waited, not forgotten, just waiting. Margaret held the book close for a moment, then looked toward the librarian. Thank you, she said softly. The librarian smiled. You're welcome. There was a pause, gentle, understanding. Would you like to keep the book? The librarian asked. Margaret considered the question, her eyes returning to the cover, to the faded title, to everything it now carried. Then she shook her head lightly. No, she said. I think it belongs here. The librarian nodded, as if she understood completely. Margaret stood slowly, the movement calm, grounded. She placed the book back on the desk, but the feeling, the memory, the connection she kept. She picked up her library card again, looked at it one last time, then slipped it gently into her pocket. Not hidden, not forgotten, but carried. As she turned toward the door, the space around her felt different, not because it had changed, but because she had. The past was no longer a distant place. It was something she had touched, something she had understood, in a new way. She stepped outside. The air felt warmer now. Or perhaps she noticed it more. The trees moved gently. The light softened the street, and everything felt quietly connected. Margaret began to walk, not back into the past, but forward, with it beside her. Because some stories do not end. They simply wait for us to return. And when we do, they give us something we didn't know we needed. Not answers, not closure, but understanding. A quiet kind. The kind that settles deep inside and stays. Margaret paused for a moment. Under the shade of a tree, she looked up, through the leaves, toward the sky, and for the first time in a long while, she smiled. Not a big smile, not one that needed to be seen, just a small, gentle one. For a memory, for a message, for a moment that had found its way back to her. And as she continued walking, the world around her remained the same. But inside, something had quietly changed. Something had come full circle. And in that quiet completion, there was peace. If this story touched something in you, if it reminded you of a memory, a place, or a person you once knew, then perhaps there is something waiting for you too. Something small, something quiet, something you thought was lost, but is simply waiting to be found again. Take a moment, slow down, listen to the gentle spaces in your life, because sometimes the most meaningful stories are the ones we almost forgot. And if you enjoy learning English this way, through calm, emotional, and meaningful stories, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and continue this journey with us. There are many more stories waiting, just like this one.